poor girl asked a black millionaire to sleep in his doghouse. His response shocked everyone. Warm light spilled from the windows of a sleek, stone-fronted house in an exclusive Austin neighborhood. At the edge of the driveway, a small figure stood perfectly still. 10-year-old Lila Carter pressed her fingers through the iron gate, a frayed backpack hanging from her shoulders, and sneakers several sizes too large slapping softly against her ankles. Her breath rose in white clouds as she leaned toward the security camera and whispered the only thing she could think to ask. Could she sleep in the doghouse tonight? Inside, Marcus Reed looked up from his office monitor, pausing at the grainy feed. He was used to late-night deliveries, not a child at his gate. The glow of his screens reflected against his glasses as he watched her shift her weight, clutching the strap of her bag tighter with every passing second. 100 reasons flickered through his mind. Call the police, call social services, close the blinds. He didn't do any of them. Marcus pushed back his chair, crossed the marble foyer, and stepped into the cool night air. The iron gate clicked as it opened, the sound startling in the quiet street. Lila's eyes widened, but she didn't step back. She stayed rooted, waiting to hear whether this stranger would offer shelter or send her back into the dark. And that is where everything began. Marcus guided Lila across the polished stone entryway, the faint echo of their footsteps making the hall feel even larger. She looked impossibly small against the sweeping staircase and the tall windows glowing with soft city light. Her fingers clutched the strap of her faded backpack as if it were the only solid thing in the room. Without asking, Marcus moved toward the kitchen and set a plate on the counter. The smell of warm food filled the air, and Lila's eyes followed every movement, wary but hungry. She perched at the edge of a stool, back straight, shoes dangling above the floor. He noticed the raw red marks where the straps of her bag had dug into her shoulders. He said nothing at first. She said nothing either. Only when she began to eat did her small shoulders loosen slightly, and even then the backpack stayed on. It was not only her belongings she was guarding, but a sense of safety she could not afford to lose. Marcus glanced at her and caught flashes of his own childhood. He remembered waiting outside a diner in Tucson, dust blowing around his torn sneakers, hoping someone might offer leftover bread. Years later, after long nights coding on borrowed laptops and living on instant noodles, he had become the man in this house with a smart security system and silent automatic lights. Looking at Lila now, he felt the past and present collide. Across the street, a curtain stirred. Someone was already watching. In another window, a phone screen lit up, a message being typed. Marcus knew how quickly a story could take on a life of its own in a tight-knit, high-end neighborhood. He told himself that letting a stranger child stay inside was not exactly a plan. Yet, as Lila's fork scraped the plate, his resolve to send her away weakened. He offered her a blanket, but she refused to take off the backpack. She drifted to sleep on the corner of the sectional couch, curled up like a bird in a nest that was not hers. The quiet hum of the air system made the room feel even emptier. Marcus watched her from the doorway, hands in his pockets. He had worked his whole life to build a fortress of privacy. Now a small stranger was sleeping in the center of it. In the guest room, his phone buzzed. A neighborhood group chat flashed on the screen. Words like unfamiliar minor, concern, and be careful blinked up at him. He closed the app without replying. He did not want their fear to shape his next move. He paced the floor instead, weighing kindness against reputation. He could call social services. He could drive her to a shelter. He could also do nothing and hope she left by morning. None of the options felt right. Morning light spilled across the marble floor when Lila opened her eyes. She sat up quickly, scanning the room as if expecting someone to drag her out. Marcus entered with 2 folded shirts and a small pair of leggings. They were his niece's from a visit years ago. He placed them gently on the arm of the couch. "Bathroom's down the hall," he said. "You can change if you want." His tone was measured, not soft but not cold either. She nodded once and disappeared behind the door. When she returned, the clothes hung loose but clean. Her hair was damp where she had tried to smooth it with water. The backpack was back on her shoulders. Marcus realized she was still ready to run. He poured juice into a glass and set it near her. She stood instead of sitting, watching him as though he might change his mind at any second. He explained that she could stay for a short time, just until things were clearer. He told her he would need to know some basics, No names of people she feared, no exact details, just enough to keep her safe. His words were calm but lined with unspoken conditions. She listened, lips pressed tight, and finally gave a small nod. Out on the street, another car slowed near the gate. Someone inside took a photo. Marcus felt a flash of irritation but did not let it show. He had chosen to open the gate the night before. Now he would choose how to handle the consequences. He drew the blinds halfway and asked Lila if she wanted more to eat. She shook her head, eyes darting toward the door. The unspoken question hung between them. How long could this fragile arrangement last before someone tried to break it? That evening, as shadows lengthened, Marcus set a second blanket at the end of the couch. He left the hallway light on, not bright enough to wake her, but enough to show she was not alone. From the window he could see the faint glow of Mrs. Whitmore's porch light across the street. The older woman had lived there for decades and noticed every change. If she had already seen Lila, the entire block would know by morning. Marcus inhaled slowly and turned away from the glass. He reminded himself of the boundaries he had drawn. This was temporary. He was offering a safe stop, not a permanent refuge. Yet when he looked at Lila curled up again, shoes still on, backpack still strapped, he felt the boundaries blur. Her presence had turned his silent, curated home into a place of questions. Who had she run from? What had she endured? And why, of all doors in Austin, had she come to his? Outside, the night deepened. In group chats, messages multiplied. Inside, the house held two people linked by something unspoken, a past of being on the wrong side of the gate. Marcus closed his laptop without reading the newest headlines about him. He had enough to handle inside his own walls. A firm knock echoed through the quiet house. Marcus set his coffee down and glanced at the front monitor. Two men in pressed shirts stood at the gate with Mrs. Whitmore between them. Her pearls caught the morning light like tiny drops of frost. Their smiles were neat and polite, but their eyes flicked toward the house with a kind of ownership that made his chest tighten. He opened the door slowly, the air between them heavy with unspoken accusations. "Good morning," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice sweet but lined with steel. "We thought we would stop by to see if everything is all right." One of the men shifted a clipboard under his arm, the other rested his hands on his belt, as though he were holding back a verdict. They began to ask questions about the girl who had been seen at Marcus's gate the night before. Their tone carried a careful rhythm, like neighbors pretending to be concerned but keeping score at the same time. Marcus answered evenly, "Everything is fine." He felt his back muscles tighten as the man with the clipboard spoke of rumors in the group chat. Something about a homeless child, about a doghouse, about community safety. Mrs. Whitmore tilted her head and said she was only thinking of him, that a child like that could bring trouble to his doorstep. The word trouble hung in the air like a sharp smell. Down the hallway, Lila froze. She had been folding the borrowed clothes as best she could, but the voices pulled her forward like a thread. She stepped into the living room quietly, her thin arms at her sides, her oversized shoes scuffing against the floor. The three visitors turned to look at her. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Her eyes, sharper than her years, met theirs without blinking. It was not defiance. It was survival. Marcus moved to her side and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "She asked for help," he said, his voice low but firm. "That is all." The two men exchanged a glance. Mrs. Whitmore's lips pressed together. She murmured something about understanding but reminded him of the local ordinances for minors and property liability. The polite smiles had turned brittle. Lila's fingers gripped the strap of her backpack again. She stood very still, as if bracing for someone to pull her away. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the thought. He looked back at his neighbors and said more clearly, "She will be safe here until we find out what is best." The man with the clipboard nodded stiffly. Mrs. Whitmore offered a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. They stepped back onto the porch, whispering to each other as they left, the sound of their shoes fading down the driveway. From the window, Marcus watched them pause at the gate, the two men leaning toward Mrs. Whitmore, their heads close together. He could almost see the next message forming in the group chat. He closed the blinds and turned back to Lila. Her shoulders were trembling, but she stood tall, eyes fixed on the door as if memorizing the escape route. He told her quietly that she had done nothing wrong. She gave a small nod but did not speak. Night fell without further visitors. The house felt like an island. Marcus sat in his study, the glow of his computer screen flickering over his hands. He was used to criticism, investors who doubted him, journalists who called him reckless. But never had those critics been talking about a child under his roof. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the old anger from Tucson rise again. The memory of doors slammed in his face when he had been the one asking for a place to stay. Just before dawn, he stepped outside to breathe the cool air. At the gate, a white envelope was taped to the iron bars. No name, no signature. He pulled it free and unfolded the single sheet. The words were printed in large black letters. For the safety of our community, please remove the girl immediately. No greeting, no suggestion of help, only a demand. The paper rattled in the breeze like a flag of surrender. He crumpled the letter slowly, the edges cutting into his palm. Inside his chest, a quiet war began. He had built companies by refusing to yield to doubters. He had walked through doors that were meant to stay closed. Yet this was not about a market or a product. This was about a small human being asleep on his couch. He stared at the iron gate, the neighborhood beyond it waking up, cars starting, dogs barking. The envelope felt heavier than it should. Back inside, Lila stirred in her sleep, still wearing her shoes. The faint line between her brows made her look older than 10. Marcus stood over her, the crushed paper in his hand. He wondered how far his neighbors would go. He wondered how far he was willing to go himself. The morning light slid across the kitchen floor while Marcus poured cereal into a bowl. Lila sat at the counter, her backpack still close, tracing a finger along the rim of her cup. She watched him quietly, then asked in a small voice if she had done something wrong. Her eyes searched his face for a sign of anger or regret. Marcus set the box down and looked straight at her. "You have not done anything wrong," he said. "The problem is them, not you." His words were steady, but his jaw was tight. She nodded once, but kept staring at her spoon as if trying to disappear. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "When I was your age, I was told I did not belong," he said. "I heard it so many times I almost believed it. You are not the problem." Lila's head lifted slightly at his words. The lines on her forehead eased for a moment, but her shoulders stayed tense. Outside, the neighborhood was moving in a different rhythm. A video clip of Lila standing at Marcus's gate had been posted on social media overnight. By noon, it had been shared hundreds of times. Some comments praised Marcus for helping. Others warned he was inviting danger. A photo of his house even appeared under a headline about risk to community safety. At the grocery store, two strangers whispered near the bread aisle as he walked past. One raised a phone as if to take a picture. Marcus kept walking, holding his list tightly. On Sunday, the pastor at a nearby church spoke about the tests God gives and the duty to protect one's household, his eyes flicking toward Marcus in the pews. Marcus sat still, his hands clasped. He had built companies under public scrutiny, but this was different. This was personal. Inside the house, Lila began closing the curtains herself. She stopped looking out the window at passing cars. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Everybody's watching," she said. Marcus crouched next to her, telling her that the walls were still theirs, that she was safe. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the neighborhood pressing in. A letter from the Homeowners Association arrived in a crisp envelope. They had scheduled a formal meeting to discuss the situation. Marcus folded it and placed it on the table without a word. That afternoon, a white SUV rolled to a stop at his gate. Two caseworkers from Child Protective Services stepped out, clipboards in hand. Lila's hands shook as she saw the uniforms through the glass. "Are they here to take me?" she whispered. Marcus knelt in front of her so their eyes met. "They are here to ask questions. You are safe. I am right here." He guided her to the couch and stayed beside her while the caseworkers spoke. The older caseworker crouched to Lila's level and asked where she felt safe. Lila's answer was soft but clear. "Here." She explained that Marcus had given her food, clothes, and a place to sleep. The caseworker wrote something down, then nodded. For now, they would allow her to stay while paperwork moved forward. When the door closed behind them, Lila sagged against the arm of the couch, relief flickering across her face. Marcus watched the SUV pull away, the clipboard still visible on the dashboard. He felt the weight of a battle not yet finished. By evening, a reporter's note appeared at the gate asking for an interview. Another email from the HOA demanded his presence at the meeting. A follow-up visit from CPS was already scheduled. Marcus stood in the hallway, The notes and letters spread across his desk like chess pieces. Lila peeked from her room, her small frame silhouetted against the light. He forced a smile for her, but his mind raced. Every step forward drew more eyes, more questions, more pressure. The quiet life he had built inside those walls was gone. Yet one look at Lila clutching her backpack told him the cost of silence would be worse. Folding chairs scraped across the polished floor of the HOA clubhouse as neighbors crowded in. The air smelled of coffee and cologne, of papers printed that morning. Soft whispers moved from row to row like a current. At the front of the room, a narrow table held a single microphone. Marcus stood behind it, his shoulders squared. Near the back, Lila Carter sat small in a chair that seemed too big, her backpack clutched against her chest like a shield. The chairperson cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. Murmurs rose again as Marcus stepped forward. He looked at the faces before him, some angry, some curious, some avoiding his eyes. He spoke in a calm voice that carried through the room. "You have heard rumors," he began. "You have seen letters on my gate, but you have not heard from me." He told them about the night a 10-year-old child stood at his gate, asking only for a roof over her head. He told them about the letters demanding he send her away. "She is not a threat. She is a child," he said, his hands flat on the table. "And she did not come to sleep in a doghouse. She came to find safety. She found it in my home." For a moment the room fell still. Marcus drew a breath and let the weight of his own story rise. "When I was a boy," he said, "I knocked on doors that never opened. I told myself that if I ever had a door of my own, I would not shut it on someone who needed help." His voice stayed low but steady. "I am keeping that promise." Mrs. Whitmore shifted in her seat, pearls trembling against her collarbone. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but no words came. The silence deepened. Then a small voice rose from the back. Lila stood, her knees knocking together but her chin lifted. "I never wanted trouble," she said softly. "I just wanted somewhere safe." The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet every person in the room heard them. A few heads dropped. Others turned to look away. Her sentence cut through the polished speeches and policies like a thread through cloth. From the second row, Mr. Grant, a neighbor who had stayed quiet until now, leaned forward. "We are talking about a child," he said, his voice sharper than anyone expected. "Maybe instead of letters and gossip, we should ask how to help." His words broke the tension like glass. A few people nodded, others shifted uneasily. Mrs. Whitmore's fingers tightened around her purse, but she still said nothing. The chairperson glanced down at the agenda, then back at the room. "There will be no vote tonight," he said finally. "We will revisit this." Marcus met Lila's eyes across the chairs. She hugged her backpack tighter, but a tiny flicker of relief crossed her face. The meeting ended with no decision, yet the air felt different as people filed out, voices lower, steps slower. The days after the meeting felt quieter. Curtains still moved, but the whispers lost their edge. A loaf of fresh bread appeared on Marcus's porch one evening with no note. Another day, a stack of notebooks and colored pencils showed up inside a paper bag. No one knocked. No one signed their name. Yet the small offerings kept coming, a silent change in the wind. Marcus filled out the forms for the neighborhood school and walked with Lila through its doors on her first morning. Her backpack, once stuffed with scraps and a spare shirt, now held new books, pencils, and a lunch she had helped pack. She clutched it tightly, but her eyes roamed the hallways with quiet wonder. A teacher bent down to greet her, and Lila managed a shy smile. When the white SUV from Child Protective Services rolled up for its follow-up visit, the caseworkers found a different scene. Lila's clothes were clean and folded. Her homework sat on the table. A drawing of a house with a tree out front hung on the refrigerator. She told them she felt safe and was learning her times tables. After a short conversation in the kitchen, they agreed to let her remain under Marcus's care while longer-term arrangements were discussed. Slowly, routines took shape. Lila no longer kept her shoes on at night. She began to set the table without being asked. In the afternoons, she rode her bike down the driveway to meet a classmate from school. Marcus watched from the porch, his arms crossed, as laughter replaced the small, tight silence she had carried with her. He saw glimmers of the girl she could become when survival was no longer her only skill. Quick to help, quick to smile, eyes bright with ideas instead of fear. The house that had once felt like an island now felt like a place of movement, like a door finally standing open. The neighborhood had not turned into a parade of goodwill, and not every critic had disappeared. But enough people had stepped forward to make the difference between isolation and community. Marcus looked at Lila one evening as she spread her homework across the kitchen counter and realized the promise he had made to his younger self was alive in this small, everyday life. The storm had not been easy, yet in its passing both of them had changed. Night had settled over the quiet street. Inside the guest room, a small lamp cast a soft circle of light across the bed. Marcus pulled the blanket up over Lila's shoulders, tucking the edge beneath her chin the way his grandmother once did for him. She watched him, her fingers tracing the stitching of the quilt. "Why did you not just let me stay in the doghouse?" she asked in a small voice. "It would have been easier." Marcus paused, his hand resting on the blanket. The weight of all the nights he had spent as a boy on borrowed couches, in borrowed spaces, came back to him. He leaned closer so she could see the steadiness in his face. "Because you are not a problem to hide," he said softly. "You are a person to protect." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. For the first time since she had arrived, she unbuckled the straps of her backpack and set it down on the floor. The sound of it settling was like a door closing on an old life. Within minutes, her breathing slowed even, unguarded. She slept without her bag pressed to her chest. Across the neighborhood, porch lights blinked off one by one. People still talked, but the stories had shifted. It was no longer about scandal or suspicion. It was about a girl who found safety where she expected none, and a man who refused to turn her away. Sometimes the biggest shock is not cruelty. It is kindness. And sometimes a single open door can make an entire street, an entire community, look at itself differently.